Imagine standing in the ruins of Monte Cassino, the air sharp with pine from the hills, and the faint metallic tang of dust shaken loose by distant artillery, your boots crunching over centuries-old tiles, while a shadow slips across a thin seam of daylight in the wall. You've just turned an iron key found in a hidden basin, opening a door. The first thing they never tell you about Monte Cassino is that you could smell the monastery before you saw it, not incense or candle wax, but the faint, chalky scent of ancient stone that had been blasted open and left to weather in cold mountain air, a smell like crushed seashells and old books left in the rain, drifting down into the valley where we waited. For days we had heard the name whispered in low voices, as if speaking it too loudly might draw a mortar round. Monte Cassino, the high fortress where the German positions clung like barnacles to the mountain, where centuries-old walls now held machine gun nests instead of monks, and where the road to Rome was blocked by more than stone. You've probably read that it was a key point in the Gustav Line, the German defensive wall, but those reports never quite explain what it was like for a soldier to stand at its foot, staring up through shifting mist, knowing that every inch you climbed would be seen, tracked, and possibly ended by someone you'd never meet. Imagine for a moment that you are here with me, not as a general studying a map, but as a man in mud-soaked boots, breathing air so thin and cold it stings your teeth, feeling the weight of your helmet pressed down on your skull like a hand, urging you to keep your head low. Maybe you're already in bed now, listening to this with your own kind of quiet around you, the hum of a heater, the slow patter of rain, the creak of your house settling. And that's good, because this story isn't meant to jolt you awake. It's meant to be walked through slowly, like a candlelit hallway in an old building. So before we climb, before we wade through the smoke and the strange silences, just take a breath and know you're safe here. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because there are more nights like this ahead, more stories half forgotten by the history books, but alive in the memories of those who stood where we're about to stand. And tell me, quietly, in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I picture you there, maybe lying back, blanket tucked under your chin, a dim light by your side. Now picture this. It's February 1944, and the rain has just broken for the first time in a week, leaving behind a sky the color of tin and air, so still that every distant explosion rolls down the mountainside like a long, low drumbeat. We're in a makeshift bivouac in the valley below the monastery, a scatter of olive-drab tents and foxholes caught into wet ground. The men are quiet, not because they're all asleep, but because noise feels expensive here, as if every laugh or cough could be taxed by the enemy's ears. My rifle is propped beside me, but I'm focused on the steam, curling off a tin mug of coffee. The taste of it so bitter and metallic, it feels like it could strip paint. Around me, others are busy with the small, strange rituals of waiting for a battle to begin. One man tightens his bootlaces for the 5th time. Another writes a letter by the light of a shielded torch, pausing every few words to stare into nothing. From somewhere near the command tent comes the muffled sound of a phonograph, playing a scratchy recording of Bing Crosby, and for a brief moment, it's almost possible to believe we're just camping, that the mountain above isn't bristling with hidden barrels and watchful glass. But then a shell bursts somewhere far to the left, and the sound shakes through your chest like the shiver that runs through a church floor during a thunderstorm, and the spell breaks. There's something surreal about Monte Cassino, the way. The past and present overlap until you can't tell if you're in 6th century Italy or 20th century war. The monastery itself, when you catch glimpses through gaps in the mist, doesn't look like part of a battlefield at all. It looks like painting, a place where you'd expect to find monks moving silently along cloisters, their sandals scuffing stone. But the closer you get, the more you notice the broken edges, the scaffolds of rubble, The jagged shadows that aren't architectural at all, but are simply destruction caught mid-fall. And all the while, there's this odd detail no one really tells you. The mountain has its own sound. Not just wind, but a low, constant hum, as if the rocks themselves are vibrating from the weight of history and impact. At night, lying in your foxhole with your poncho pulled over you to keep the drizzle off, you can hear the click of stones shifting under distant boots, the occasional burst of German shouted orders carried strangely clearly through the cold air, and sometimes a thing that made some men uneasy, the faint ringing of a bell from somewhere up there, though no one could say for certain if the monastery's bells had survived the shelling. I remember once waking in the middle of the night, thinking I'd heard chanting, but when I asked a man beside me in the morning, he just smiled without humor and said, "That's the wind here. It sings in Latin." Even the food takes on. The mountains taste hardtack that crumbles into dust in your mouth, tinned meat that smells faintly of wet stone. We move slowly up the trails toward the slopes, boots slipping in the mud, the straps of our packs pulling into our shoulders. The monastery always there above us, like a silent audience. And as we climb, the view shifts. The valley spreads out behind us, the tents becoming little green and brown dots, the roads winding away into hills where the clouds seem to settle for good. Somewhere ahead, under the stones and the echoes, the battle waits. But before we reach it, there's one more thing, one strange, almost tender fact about Monte Cassino that I'll tell you in the next part. A detail so quiet you could miss it entirely, unless you were standing right where I was that night, just before the shelling began again. That quiet detail I promised you is one of those things you wouldn't find in an official report. And yet, for the men who were there, it became part of the landscape itself. Monte Cassino had birds. Small mountain birds that didn't seem to care about the war, darting between crags and bits of ruined wall as if the monastery was still whole. Even on days when artillery thundered from dawn till dusk, they would flit past, unstartled, their wings catching the light in quick flashes like tiny mirrors. No one could figure out why they stayed. Perhaps their nests had been there for generations. Perhaps the mountain offered them some kind of safety the rest of us couldn't feel. At night, when the guns went quiet for an hour or two, their faint chirps would rise in the darkness, and for a moment it was possible to imagine we were simply campers under an indifferent sky. The night before our push toward the monastery, I lay awake in my foxhole listening to them, mingling with the other sounds, the creak of my own gear shifting against my ribs, the distant mutter of a sentry changing position, the faint slap of water in a mud puddle beside my head, and it was as if the mountain was humming an untranslatable lullaby. The morning came gray and metallic, the air smelling of both rain and smoke, and the order to move was passed down the line in voices low enough to keep from bouncing off the rock faces. We moved in single file, each man with his head bowed under, the weight of his pack, our breath pluming out in ghostly bursts that hung in the stillness before vanishing. Above us, the monastery's outline shifted in and out of fog like a reluctant apparition, sometimes crisp against the sky, sometimes dissolving into pale nothing. My boots slipped on wet stone steps that had likely been worn smooth by centuries. Of monks' feet, though now they were slick with mud and something darker. We passed the carcass of a mule, its burden of ammunition spilled across the path like so many dull tin pebbles, and someone behind me muttered a prayer without realizing. It was out loud. The strange thing about climbing toward a place you know will try to kill you is that your mind starts to fill with details that have nothing to do with survival. The way a crack in the wall looks like a map of some forgotten country. The way rainwater runs in delicate silver threads from one stone to another. The way your own heartbeat starts to sound like a slow drum in your ears. By the time we reached the next staging point, my hands were stiff from the cold, and I could feel the fine grit of powdered stone on my teeth. every time I closed my mouth. We crouched in what must have once been a garden, the walls half collapsed. A fig tree stripped bare for winter, leaning like an old man against the rubble. A chaplain moved among us, offering quiet words, a hand on a shoulder, a blessing murmured in the same voice you'd use to tell someone the time. Off to the right, a medic squatted over a wounded man brought down from the slopes above, his hands moving quickly but gently, the way you'd handle a fragile vase. Even here, in this in-between place where we waited for the signal to advance, the air was full of contradictions. The acrid bite of cordite and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs from the overgrown ground under our boots. The tense stillness of men who knew what came next, and the restless flutter of those impossible. Birds overhead. Then came the sound, the heavy, deliberate cough of our own artillery opening up behind us, followed by the deeper, more resonant reply from the German guns dug into the rock above. It wasn't chaos, not yet. It was more like a conversation. Between giants, each blow measured, each echo rolling down the mountainside until it met us and settled in our chests. A man beside me lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake, and for some reason, I couldn't look away from the way the eye. Ember glowed against the pale fog, a tiny defiance against the grayness. The grayness. The order came, and we began to move again, stepping over broken stone and tangled wire, keeping low as shrapnel clinked and skittered against the walls. At one point, I glanced up and saw through a gap the monastery's main arch, or what was left of it, framing a rectangle of sky so clean and blue it felt like it belonged to another world entirely. And that's when the first real close burst came, a spray of dust and rock that slapped my helmet and left my ears ringing. Even in that moment, crouched in the lee of a wall, I found myself thinking about those birds again, wondering if they were still flitting above us, tracing their own invisible lines through the smoke. But soon the thought was gone, swallowed by the noise and the need to keep moving. We advanced into a section of the old cloister, where shadows clung stubbornly even at midday, the air colder than it had been outside. And here we found something unexpected, signs of life that didn't belong to soldiers. There was a wooden table with one leg broken, but still standing, a ceramic bowl with a chip in its rim, and scattered across the floor, pages from what must have been a hymn book, the notes and Latin words blurred by water, but still legible in places. One man picked up a page, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his jacket without saying a word. We didn't linger. The path ahead was calling, and the enemy was close enough now that we could hear the click and clack of movement above. But as we filed out, I glanced back once and saw the bowl catch a ray of light through the broken roof, and for a moment it looked like something holy. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment we reached the very walls themselves, and how what waited there was nothing like what we had imagined in the long nights below. The walls of the monastery, up close, were nothing like the distant, ghostly silhouette we had stared at for weeks. They rose in jagged slabs, the pale stone pocked and blackened by countless strikes, each crater telling the story of a shell's brief conversation with history. The air here had a different weight, to it thicker, as if carrying the dust of centuries suspended in every breath, and each inhalation left a faint shock taste on the tongue. We hugged the edges, moving in short bursts from what cover we could find. Half-collapsed arches, mounds of rubble, the skeletal remains of stairways that now led nowhere. Overhead, the sky was torn between two moods patches of brilliant blue. Above the peaks, and low, ragged clouds snagged on the monastery's highest points, drifting like tired sentries. The Germans had dug themselves deep into these stones, their positions hidden behind carefully camouflaged apertures that, from a distance, might have been mistaken for missing bricks. You could feel them before you saw them, small shifts in the air, a prickle on the skin, the way a silence suddenly pressed harder against your ears. We crouched behind a section of wall, so thick it seemed immortal. But even here, chips flaked away when stray rounds struck, raining tiny pebbles onto our helmets. Somewhere above, a machine gun spat a short, impatient burst, not aimed at us, but close enough to make every nerve flinch. And then came one of those odd moments that only war seems to produce. A lull so deep that the distant pop of a single bird call felt louder than the battle. In that pause, one of our men pointed out an ancient carving on the stone beside him. A faintly etched cross, worn to almost nothing, that must have been there since before America was even a dream. We stared at it for a few seconds, as if trying to draw some invisible strength from its endurance, before the world reminded us where we were with another thud that sent a shiver through the ground. Moving along the outer wall, we passed a section where the roof had collapsed into what might once have been the scriptorium, the place where monks copied texts by hand. Now it was a pit of shattered beams and torn manuscripts, pages plastered to the stones by rain and mud, their ink bleeding into strange shapes like maps of imaginary seas. A gust lifted one page and sent it spiraling toward me. I caught it without thinking and saw that it was a fragment of plancient notation, the square notes lined like soldiers on a staff. I don't know why, but I tucked it into my breast pocket and carried it the rest of the way up. The closer we came to the main entrance, the more the sound changed. It was no longer the clean crack of rifles, but a deeper, more resonant booming, as if the mountain itself were answering back. Shouts in German echoed from hidden corridors, followed by the sharp clink of a spent casing rolling across stone. A sudden rush sent us diving behind a heap of masonry, the air filling with dust so fine it turned the world into a pale haze. Through that haze, I caught sight of something strange. A line of sandbags arranged, not in the expected neat wall, but in a curved shape, almost like an altar. On top of it sat a helmet, German, with a sprig of something green tucked into its strap. I can't tell you if it was some soldier's private joke, a makeshift grave marker, or simply a place to rest it, but the sight of that green alive against the ruin stuck in my mind. We pressed forward in fits and starts, the entrance now close enough that I could see the grain of the wood in its great doors, though one hung twisted from its hinges. Just before we reached it, we found ourselves in a courtyard choked with debris. Here, the past and present collided outright. Fragments of marble columns lay beside spent shell casings. A toppled statue of Saint Benedict lay face down in the mud, one arm snapped away entirely. I remember pausing there, not from fatigue, but because my eyes had caught something small, an intact candle, stub in a corner, its wax mottled from age and heat. I wondered if it had been lit during the shelling, if someone had dared to bring a small light into this darkness. We didn't linger. The order was to push in, to clear what we could. But as we crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped again, the light dimmed, and the air took on that close, mineral smell you only find in ancient places untouched by sun. Inside, sound behaved differently. Gunfire outside became a muffled heartbeat. Footsteps rang louder than they should, and somewhere, though, no one could agree exactly where, there was a slow, steady drip of water. In the shadows, it was possible to imagine the monks still here, moving silently through the cloisters, except now their robes were replaced by our field jackets and the sacred texts by rifles. Every room we entered seemed to hold a story we couldn't read. A row of empty wooden shelves, a shattered bell lying in a pool of dust, a fresco with a saint's eyes erased by shrapnel. And then, in one small chamber, we found a pile of boots American, British, German, all heaped together, as if the mountain had decided not to keep track of who had worn them. We moved deeper still, past a corridor where the light narrowed to a ribbon, and the air felt so still it seemed sacrilegious to breathe too loudly. Somewhere ahead, a door stood slightly ajar, and a faint, flickering light danced through the gap. What we found when we opened it was the last thing we expected to see in the middle of that ruin. And it's what I'll tell you in the next part. The door swung open without resistance, its hinges groaning softly in the still air, and the flicker we had seen spilled into the corridor in warm, uneven waves that seemed almost alien after so many days of cold gray light. Inside was a room no bigger than a chapel anteroom, though whether it had been a place of prayer or storage we couldn't tell. The walls bore faint traces of frescoes, colors washed nearly to nothing, like the last echo of a song. In the center, on a small stone table, burned a single oil lamp, the flame steady despite the drafts that must have seeped in through the cracks. Around it were objects that made no military sense. A loaf of bread gone hard as brick, a wooden cup half filled with water, and beside it a string of rosary beads whose crucifix had snapped off, leaving the string curled like a sleeping snake. No one spoke for a moment, as if words might break whatever strange pact had allowed this tiny pocket of stillness to exist in the middle of the siege. The lamp's light painted our faces in amber, catching on the brass buttons of jackets and the damp curve of helmet rims. And for a few heartbeats, it was possible to forget that the enemy was only a wall's thickness away. One of the men stepped forward and reached out to touch the bread, but thought better of it, pulling his hand back with a sheepish shrug. Another crouched to study the beads, then looked over his shoulder at me and said, half under his breath, "Who do you think lit it?" There was no answer. We searched the corners, half expecting to find some local civilian, or even a monk who had refused to leave. But there was no one, only dust, and the faint smell of olive oil from the lamp. The odd thing was that the wick had burned low, yet the flame was still strong, as if someone had topped it up not long ago. Outside the door, the war reminded us of itself with a dull concussion that sent a fine mist of plaster down from the ceiling. The lamp's flame trembled, then steadied. Again, almost defiantly. We didn't stay long. Time here felt dangerous, as if the quiet might tempt us into forgetting the work ahead. Moving on, we followed a narrow corridor that twisted through the bowels of the monastery, each turn revealing another layer of ruined staircases leading into collapsed voids, walls shored up with sandbags, niches where statues had been toppled, but their empty plinths still stood like sentinels. Somewhere above us, boots pounded along stone, and the clatter of gear echoed through unseen passages. We emerged into what must have been the main courtyard before the bombing, now a jagged field of rubble broken by the skeletal outlines of colonnades. Here, the air was alive with the smell of wet stone and cordite, and every sound bounced strangely, as if the walls were still trying to remember their old acoustics. It was here that we saw the strangest thing, yet a section of wall, somehow untouched, still bearing a perfectly preserved fresco of a saint holding a book. The colors were vivid deep reds, golds, and blues so clean, it looked as if it had been painted yesterday. Around it, everything was ruin, but this one image had survived as if shielded by some invisible hand. We stood staring until a voice urged us forward. The next task was to secure the eastern wing, and to get there, we had to pass under a section of roof that looked ready to fall at the slightest touch. Every step sent dust spiraling down, and the smell of charred wood grew stronger. In the dimness, I caught sight of a small wooden stool tipped onto its side, one leg broken clean through, and beside it, a child's shoe too small to belong to any soldier, its leather cracked with age. I picked it up without thinking, its weight almost nothing, and carried it with me until we reached the far door. Beyond lay the eastern wing, where the light was dimmer still, and the air carried a new scent-damp earth, as though the mountain itself was breathing through the stones. This was the cloister garden, or what remained of it, now a hollow space where shattered columns stood among tufts of stubborn grass and pools of rainwater. The grass was flattened in places, as if someone had walked there recently, but the only movement was the slow ripple of water under the faint breeze. In one corner stood a well, its stone rim intact, and when I leaned over, the darkness below swallowed the dim light entirely. I thought I heard a faint drip, but it might have been the wind. It was here, in this quiet, that I began to feel the weight of the place pressing in, not just the battle, but the centuries of lives that had moved through these spaces before we came with rifles and helmets. The sensation was broken by the call to move on. The next section was ahead, and intelligence suggested it might hold something we hadn't seen, yet a passageway leading under the monastery itself. What we found when we stepped into that underground dark was unlike anything the official histories describe, and it's where the next part of this story will take you. The entrance to the underground passage was nothing more than a dark opening framed by two leaning slabs of stone, half hidden behind a mound of debris and the splintered remains of what might once have been a heavy door. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust enough to realize that the darkness beyond was not just shadow but space, receding into the mountain. The first steps inside were accompanied by that change in air you only notice when you move from open. Ruined to enclosed ancient stone, the sudden coolness, the smell of damp earth and old mortar, and a faint metallic tang that seemed to come from nowhere. Our boots scuffed against uneven flagstones, some of them loose and rocking underfoot, and the sound of our movement was swallowed almost instantly by the thick walls. Flashlights were scarce, so most of what we saw at first was lit in thin cones of pale light, narrow arches cut directly into the rock, the occasional alcove with a crumbling ledge, and once the outline of a doorway that had been bricked up so long ago the mortar had turned the same color as the stone. Every few yards, the passage would kink to one side, the ceiling dropping low enough that we had to duck, and in those moments the air felt almost syrupy, heavy with the weight of the monastery above. Someone behind me muttered about how the Germans had probably rigged this place with traps, and the thought settled in my chest like a cold pebble. Still, we pressed on, because whatever this space had been for storage, retreat, or something older, it was a route we couldn't ignore. We passed under a pair of arches carved more finely than anything we'd seen above ground, their capitals etched with curling vines and small figures worn nearly faceless by time. And I remember wondering if the monks had used this space during storms, when the mountain shook with thunder. About 50 yards in, we found the first oddity, a long wooden bench set against the wall, its surface smooth and dustless, as if someone had sat there recently. On it rested a small brass bell, no bigger than the palm of my hand, and next to it a folded scrap of paper with writing too faint to read in our light. One of the men pocketed the bell, saying it might make a good keepsake, but the paper he left untouched. The corridor narrowed, and here the walls were lined with niches, each holding something different: broken pottery, an iron hook, a single leather-bound book so swollen with damp it could barely be recognized. In one niche, I noticed a wooden crucifix lying face down, the wood darkened with age. When I lifted it, the smell of cedar still lingered faintly. The sound down here was strange. Our voices seemed to fall flat, but every drip of water or scuff of stone echoed as if repeated from far away. At one bend, the light caught on something ahead, and we slowed, weapons raised, not that we expected anything living. What we found was a collapsed section of wall revealing a small side chamber, inside which lay a jumble of objects: two dented helmets, a coil of rusted wire, and oddly, a row of intact glass jars lined neatly against the far wall, each sealed with wax. They held nothing threatening, only what looked like herbs and dried flowers, their colors ghostly in the dimness. It was the kind of sight that made you wonder who had been here before, and why they had chosen to leave something so fragile in a place so close to destruction. We moved on, the floor sloping gently downward until the walls began to change less cut stone, more rough rock, as if we were slipping into the mountain's natural bones. The air cooled further, and the smell shifted toward something deeper, more mineral. Here, the ceiling opened into a vaulted chamber, larger than anything we'd seen above or below. Its floor was littered with fallen stone and chunks of plaster, but at its center stood a single column, unbroken, bearing the carved image of an open hand. The hand's fingers were splayed, the palm facing outward as though in warning or greeting. We circled it once, uncertain what to make of it, before noticing the faintest trace of paints still clinging to the carving, a thin band of gold around the wrist. Just beyond, another passage beckoned, its mouth low and crooked, and as we ducked into it, the light behind us seemed to dim all at once. The walls here pressed close, brushing shoulders, and the floor tilted slightly, forcing us to brace ourselves against the stone as we moved. Somewhere ahead came a sound of soft rustling, like cloth against stone, that made every head turn. We stopped, listening, but it faded quickly, leaving only the sound of our breathing. When we emerged, it was into another small chamber, and this one was stranger still. The far wall bore a fresco in surprisingly bright reds and blacks, depicting what seemed to be a figure climbing a ladder into clouds, watched by others below. None of us could read the Latin script beneath, though one man tried, tracing the letters with his finger until dust smeared them away. In the center of the floor was a square opening, framed by stone, with a wooden ladder descending into pure dark. We had no orders to go further, but the way the air moved from below suggested a larger space yet, and perhaps something the enemy hadn't expected us to find. What we did next, and what lay down that ladder, is something I'll take you into in the next part. The ladder groaned under our weight as we descended, each rung worn smooth and dark with age, its edges rounded as if countless hands in boots had passed this way long before we arrived with our rifles and steel helmets. The wood flexed ever so slightly underfoot, and with each careful step the light from above shrank to a pale square until it was just a faint suggestion against the black. The air down here was cooler still, touched with the scent of damp limestone, and something faintly metallic, like the smell left on your fingers after handling old coins. When my boots finally met the floor, the sound was dull, cushioned by a layer of fine dust that seemed undisturbed for decades, except for a narrow track through it, as if something had been dragged or carried away in recent days. Our flashlights fanned out, catching the edges of the chamber we had entered. Walls of rough-cut stone, their surfaces beaded with moisture, and in one corner, a stack of wooden crates, so rotted that their planks crumbled under a single touch. Inside one, we found glass bottles lying on their sides, corked but empty, their labels long since dissolved. In another, a rusted lantern, its wick still in place, but fused into a lump by time. The strangest find was against the far wall, a row of iron hooks driven into the stone, each holding a single object. A leather satchel, a dented mess tin, a length of coiled rope, and oddly, a folded blanket that disintegrated into powder when touched. The quiet here was so complete that every small sound, a boot scrape, the faint click of a safety being shifted, seemed magnified. Moving deeper, we found a passage leading away from the chamber, its floor slightly damp underfoot. Here the walls bore faint chisel marks, uneven as if carved by hand in haste, and every few paces we'd pass small recesses cut into the rock, some empty, others containing curious remnants. A clay jar half filled with dried seeds, a rusted key without a lock, a length of rosary chain tangled like seaweed. We speculated in low voices about the purpose of this place, whether it had been part of the monastery cellars, a refuge during earlier sieges, or something priding even the monks. The air grew thicker as we pressed on, carrying a faint, earthy musk that hinted at open ground somewhere ahead. At last the passage widened into a long, low hall, its ceiling braced by massive wooden beams blackened with age. At the far end, against a wall mottled with damp, stood a stone altar no taller than a man's waist. Its surface was bare save for a shallow groove carved into it, leading toward a narrow drain hole at the edge. Whatever ceremonies had been performed here were lost to time, though the shape of the groove suggested they had been deliberate. Nearby lay a small wooden box with a broken clasp. Inside, wrapped in linen stiff with age, were several small ceramic figurines, each larger than a fist, their features worn to near blankness. One, though, still bore the trace of painted eyes. No one could say if they were devotional tokens, offerings, or something else entirely, but the sight of them in this hidden place stirred something unsettled in me, less fear than the awareness of standing inside another people's memory. As we turned to leave, our lights caught on a low archway to the right of the altar, almost hidden by a curtain of hanging roots that had worked their way down from the soil above. Pushing through them, we entered a narrow, twisting tunnel where the air was warmer and carried a faint, rhythmic sound, too steady to be dripping water. It took me a moment to recognize it, the dull, muffled boom of artillery, distorted by layers of stone, like thunder rolling through the bones of the earth. We followed the tunnel for what felt like 50 yards, until it ended abruptly in a small chamber with a single opening in the ceiling. A rope ladder hung there, its fibers frayed but intact, and faint daylight spilled down in a pale, dusty shaft. The possibility that this was an enemy access point made us wary, but curiosity and the need to know where it led kept us from turning back. As one man began to climb, the rest of us waited in the dimness, listening to the creak of the rope and the distant rumble above. What we found at the top of that ladder was not another section of ruin, but something startlingly alive, and I'll take you there in the next part. The rope ladder swayed as the first man reached the top, his silhouette framed for a moment against the pale light before he pulled himself over and vanished from view. The rest of us followed one by one, the fibers scratching at our palms, boots knocking softly against the wall of the shaft. The air grew warmer with each rung, tinged with the faint scent of vegetation, something green and living, impossibly out of place after hours of stone, dust, and ruin. When my head rose above the opening, I blinked against the sudden brightness, my eyes adjusting to a small, enclosed courtyard shielded on all sides by high monastery walls that had somehow escaped the worst of the shelling. The sunlight here was softer, filtered through a canopy of tangled vines that had claimed the upper ledges, their leaves trembling gently in the breeze. In the center stood a gnarled fig tree, its branches heavy with pale, unripe fruit, and around its roots the ground was carpeted in a thin layer of moss that seemed untouched by boots. The air was warmer here, and carried a sweetness from this vines, mingling with the faint mineral undertone from the stone. It was quiet, eerily so, given that only a wall's thickness away, the battle was still grinding on. But in that quiet there was life. A cluster of sparrows darted between the vines, and somewhere in the shadows a cat, lean and gray, watched us with unblinking eyes before slipping away through a narrow gap in the wall. The courtyard bore signs of human care, but not recent an overturned clay pot, a bench with one leg splintered, and against the far wall a weathered wooden door, half open, revealing darkness beyond. It felt like stepping into a pocket of another time, as if we had stumbled into the monastery's memory rather than its present. One man knelt to scoop water from a shallow stone basin near the fig tree, tasting it and nodding rainwater, cool and clean. Another plucked a fig, turning it over in his hand before setting it back gently, perhaps unwilling to disturb what felt almost sacred. The ground was scattered with dry fig leaves, brittle underfoot, their veins etched like maps, and in one, corner lay a small wicker basket collapsed into itself, its weave frayed. We spread out cautiously, scanning for any sign that the enemy had used this space, but found none. No shell casings, no discarded gear, only the long-settled dust of neglect. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves overhead, and faintly, the distant boom of guns filtered into a kind of dull heartbeat. Standing beneath the fig tree, I felt an odd sense of reprieve, as if the war had paused just long enough to let us remember that the world could still grow things, still harbor quiet corners where life clung stubbornly on. In the far corner of the courtyard, the half-open door drew us closer. Its hinges moaned when we pushed it, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness that smelled faintly of incense and damp plaster. The steps were worn in the center, smoothed by centuries of feet, and the air grew cooler as we descended. At the bottom, the space opened into a small chapel miraculously intact, its walls lined with faded frescoes of saints whose faces had escaped the shrapnel that had scarred so much above. A small altar stood at the far end, a white cloth draped over it, though dust lay thick on its surface. On the altar rested a single candle, unlit, and beside it a carved wooden box, its lid ajar to reveal several silver coins, dull with age. Someone whispered that they might be offerings left untouched since before the bombing, and the thought sent a ripple of stillness through us. There was a faint echo here, as if the room itself remembered prayers. No one wanted to disturb it, so we backed out quietly, closing the door behind us until it rested again in its half-open state. Returning to the courtyard, the sunlight felt warmer after the chapel's dimness. We lingered there for a few minutes, letting our eyes trace the vines, the fig tree, the gentle flutter of sparrows, an image that felt so removed from the siege. Outside that it might have been a painting hung in some faraway room. But we couldn't stay. The radio crackled, reminding us that there was more to clear, and somewhere ahead lay the north wing, rumored to hold not just enemy positions, but also something left behind from the monastery's earliest days. What we discovered there, hidden in a place no shell had touched, is where the next part will take you. The path to the north wing led us through a narrow, covered walkway where the light fell in thin, angled slices through arched openings on one side, the air tinged with both the coolness of shade and the faint warmth drifting in from the courtyard we had just left. Each step echoed softly on the worn flagstones, the sound bouncing ahead of U.S. as if some invisible presence were scouting the way. At intervals along the wall, small alcoves held weathered statue saints, scholars, and one figure whose features were so eroded that he seemed to be dissolving back into the stone entirely. In one alcove, someone had tucked a sprig of dried rosemary between the statue's folded hands, its scent faint but stubborn in the still air. The corridor ended at a set of heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron straps, their surfaces scarred, with scratches and the blackened crescents of old burn marks. They resisted when we pushed, but with a shudder and groan, the hinges yielded, opening onto a broad hall flooded with an almost unnatural stillness. This was the north wing, or what remained of it. The roof was mostly intact, high above and ribbed, vaults that disappeared into shadows, and the floor was a mosaic of geometric patterns, some tiles still bright in red, blue, and gold despite centuries underfoot. Here and there, large chunks of debris lay where parts of the upper walls had collapsed, but much of the space felt untouched by the chaos outside, as though some unspoken boundary had kept the war at bay. A far wall was lined with tall bookcases, many empty, their shelves warped by damp, but a few still held books whose spines were cracked but legible. One of our men, a school teacher before the war, couldn't resist pulling a volume free. He opened it gingerly, and we saw pages of Latin script alongside delicate illustrations of herbs, animals, and astronomical charts. A bestiary, he murmured, tracing one image of a stag with gold leaf antlers before sliding the book carefully back. We advanced slowly, the room's silence encouraging a kind of reverence, until something caught my eye. A narrow door half hidden behind one of the bookcases, its edges outlined by a sliver of light. Squeezing past, we opened it to reveal a small chamber no bigger than a monk's cell. Inside was a writing desk layered with dust, a single wooden chair tucked neatly beneath it, and on the desk an inkpot still holding the hardened residue of black ink. Beside it lay a quill, its feather mottled but intact, and a sheet of parchment on which someone had begun to write before stopping mid-sentence centuries ago. The words, though faded, spoke of a visitor to the monastery who had brought news from far away, but the sentence broke off after the phrase venit tempestape, the storm is coming. We stood in that room for a while, feeling the quiet press in from all sides until the radio static pulled us back to the present. Our orders were to sweep the rest of the wing, checking for enemy movement, so we left the chamber and moved deeper into the hall. Toward the far end, a raised platform held what must have been a lectern or pulpit, now toppled onto its side, and behind it a set of steps descended into a small crypt. The air down there was colder, tinged with a faint smell of beeswax and stone, and the walls were lined with niches holding long-forgotten remains. Some were marked with plaques bearing Latin inscriptions, others with only a carved cross. The strangest niche, though, held no bones only, a small wooden chest bound in iron. Its lock was rusted through, so with a careful push we opened it to find a bundle of cloth wrapping something solid. Inside lay a bronze medallion no larger than a man's palm, its face engraved with an image of the monastery as it must have looked when first built, the walls whole, the towers unbroken. Around the edge ran a Latin inscription we couldn't fully translate. The one word Custel stood, out, guardian. We passed it from hand to hand in the dim light, each of us struck by how warm the metal felt, despite the chill in the room. Above, the muffled thump of artillery returned, reminding us that the moment's stillness was borrowed time. We ascended from the crypt and crossed to a side door that led out into a narrow passageway running along the outer wall of the north wing. Through narrow arrow slits, we could see the valley far below, mist pooling in the folds of the hills, and in the distance, the faint glint of water. The wind here carried a sharper edge, laced with the scent of pine from somewhere unseen. The passage bent sharply, and as we rounded the corner, we saw ahead another door, this one ajar, its lower, half shrouded in shadow. Beyond it lay a space none of us had seen on any of the monastery's maps, a place that, by the look of it, had been deliberately kept hidden. What waited inside was unlike anything else we had found in Monte Cassino, and it's there. I'll take you in the next part. The door gave way with a reluctant sigh when we pushed it open, swinging inward to reveal a room, unlike any we had seen in the monastery. So far, not a chapel, or a storeroom, or a hall, but something between a workshop and a vault. The light was dim, filtering down through a small, high window smeared with centuries of dust, casting long slanted beams that caught the motes drifting lazily in the air. Along the walls stood tall cabinets of dark wood, their glass fronts clouded with age, and inside we could just make out rows of objects, brass instruments with dials and pointers, rolls of parchment bound in leather straps, and bundles of herbs now dry and brittle, but still faintly aromatic. A long table ran down the center of the room, its surface cluttered with things left exactly as they had been the moment whoever worked here last had walked away. There was a globe of the heavens, its constellations painted in deep blues and golds that had faded unevenly where the light touched them. Beside it, a set of calipers lay half open atop a sheet of parchment bearing neat diagrams of circles and arcs. One corner of the table held a collection of ceramic jars, each labeled in careful script that was too faded to read clearly, though. One still bore the word Melissa, lemon balm, the faintest trace of its scent lingering in the wax seal. At the far end of the table lay an open book, its spine sagging, with a page filled not with Latin, but with a series of strange symbols arranged in tight columns. None of us could decipher it, though one man swore he recognized a mark he had seen in an old atlas back home. The room had the feel of a place where time had been paused, its work interrupted not by neglect, but by some abrupt, unplanned end. As we moved carefully among the cabinets, we found a drawer that slid open reluctantly, to reveal dozens of small lead discs stamped with unfamiliar emblems, each threaded with a length of twine. Another drawer held quills, their nibs stained black as if dipped yesterday, and a bundle of wax tablets scratched with faint, overlapping lines. In one shadowed corner stood a tall, narrow cupboard with its door ajar, inside which hung several robes of thick wool, their hems stiff with dust. Pinned to the inside of the cupboard door was a scrap of parchment bearing only 2 words, "Ad tenebras," to the shadows. It was one of those moments when the air in the room seemed to draw tighter, and we found ourselves speaking more quietly without realizing why. From the high window came the faint sound of the wind outside, but otherwise the room felt sealed. Away from the world, its silence unbroken for decades or more. Against the far wall, half concealed behind a leaning cabinet, we discovered a narrow hatch cut low into the stone, its edges worn smooth by hands and knees. It was barely large enough for a man to crawl through, and from within came the faintest hint of something air moving, and perhaps a low, steady sound like the hum of distant water. We debated whether it was worth exploring. The radio was all ready, reminding us of our time, but curiosity won, as it always seemed to in places like this. One by one we ducked through, the stone cool against our shoulders, until the passage widened into a small, rounded chamber. Here, the walls were bare rock, and in the center stood a stone basin, half filled with water, so still it reflected our torchlight like polished glass. Around the basin's rim, symbols had been carved, some crosses, some shapes that meant nothing to us, and in the water, perfectly preserved under the surface, lay a single iron key. It was heavy when I reached in and lifted it, the metal cold against my palm, and it bore no marking save for a faint groove along the shaft. Why it had been left here, and what it opened, none of us could guess, but the way the key caught the light made it feel like a clue in a story we didn't yet understand. We pocketed it and crawled back into the workshop-like room, the air seeming warmer now after the chamber's chill. Back in the hall, the world of the siege was waiting for us, the faint thud of distant gunfire, the low murmur of voices on the radio. But before we could rejoin it, another discovery stopped us. In the shadow beneath one of the cabinets, almost invisible unless the light struck just right, was a trapdoor of thick oak, its surface covered in the same dust that coated everything else. We could feel the faintest movement of air through its edges, warmer than the air in the room, and with that came the unmistakable scent of smoke. Whatever was below was not abandoned, not entirely. In the next part, I'll take you down through that trapdoor and into a part of Monte Cassino the official histories never seemed to mention at all. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked, the oak boards thick and fitted so snugly that it took 2 of us to pry it open, the iron hinges creaking in protest, until finally it swung back to reveal a square opening just wide enough for 1 man at a time. From below came that faint current of warmer air, laced with the unmistakable scent of smokewood smoke, not the acrid tang of explosives, which was strange enough in itself, this deep inside the monastery. The ladder fixed to the openings. Edge was made of iron, the rungs cold and slightly slick with condensation, and the sound of our boots on them rang softly into the dark as we descended. The light above shrank to a square, and then vanished entirely as the trapdoor was eased shut behind us, leaving only the narrow beam of our torches cutting through the black. The first thing we noticed at the bottom was the floor-smooth flagstones, swept clean, not the dust and rubble we had come to expect. The walls were bare stone, the mortar fresh in places, and the air here was warmer, carrying that gentle, steady drift of wood smoke. Moving forward, the tunnel bent sharply and then opened into a low-ceilinged chamber lit by a single oil lamp, burning in a niche, its glow through the shadows of our helmets long across the walls. And in that light we saw what had been hidden: a small cache of supplies, sacks of grain neatly stacked, tins of food in rows, a bundle of blankets, and against one wall a rack holding a few rifles, their barrels wrapped in oiled cloth. The most surprising detail, though, was a narrow hearth built into the far wall, its fire reduced to embers, but still giving off a faint warmth. Above it, a blackened iron pot hung from a hook, the smell of something herbal and faintly sweet lingering in the air. It was clear someone had been here recently, though there was no sign of them now. No footprints, no discarded gear, nothing but the quiet suggestion of presence. We moved through the chamber cautiously, checking each corner, each recess. In one, we found a stack of clay jars sealed with wax, their surfaces etched with marks that looked more decorative than functional simple lines, spirals, and a shape like a stylized sun. In another, a low wooden bench held a scattering of objects: a brass compass whose needle still swung, a half-empty packet of tobacco, a folded scrap of parchment with a hand-drawn map of the monastery and its surrounding slopes. The map was odd, some corridors marked with crosses, others with small stars, and one place in the north wing circled twice in red ink. Whoever had drawn it knew the layout better than any of us, and the fact that this place wasn't on any of our own maps made the discovery unsettling. Against the back wall, partially hidden behind a draped blanket, was another door, this one built of lighter wood and reinforced with metal strips. It wasn't locked, only latched, and when we pushed it open, the smell of the smoke grew stronger. Beyond lay a narrow passage, whose ceiling was so low we had to stoop, the walls lined with shelves holding more supplies, candles, bottled water, boxes of matches, and here and there, odd personal items: a pair of spectacles, a battered copy of Virgil's Aeneid, a tin whistle. The passage ended abruptly in another chamber, smaller than the first, but here the hearth was still lit, the fire fresh, and beside it sat a small iron kettle with steam curling from its spout. On the floor nearby was a stool, its seat worn, smooth, and beside it a pair of boots, neatly placed side by side. We froze, listening, expecting to hear movement, but there was nothing, no breath, no shuffle of feet, just the quiet pop of the fire. It was as if whoever had been here had stepped away only moments before. On the wall above the hearth hung a framed piece of parchment bearing a Latin phrase in careful script: "In silentio fortitudo," in silence, strength. The words seemed to echo the feel of the place, this hidden refuge within a fortress already. Under siege, we searched for another exit, but found none. The only way out was the way we had come. Still, before leaving, one man reached into the kettle and drew out a small cloth bundle, its contents warm to the touch, bread, wrapped in linen. It was fresh, still soft. He replaced it carefully, perhaps feeling, as we all did, that to take anything from here would be to break some unspoken rule. As we climbed back toward the trapdoor, the scent of smoke and bread followed us, and when we emerged into the dusty workshop above, the contrast between the living warmth below and the still, untouched air here was sharp enough to make us pause. Outside the room, the war was waiting, and ahead of us lay the climb to the monastery's highest surviving tower, where rumor had it the view revealed not only the battlefield, but the land stretching far toward Rome. In the next part, I'll take you up that climb, step by step, to what might have been the most haunting view in all of Monte Cassino. The climb to the highest surviving tower began in a narrow spiral staircase tucked into the corner of the north wing, its entrance marked only by a sagging archway half-choked with fallen plaster. The first few steps were chipped and uneven, their edges rounded by centuries of sandals and boots, and as we began to ascend, the air cooled noticeably, carrying the faint mineral scent of stone that had been sealed away from the weather for years. Each turn of the staircase revealed another small detail, the way one step was worn deeper on the right side from centuries of right-footed climbers. The faint graffiti carved into the wall by some long-gone hand, a single rusted horseshoe nailed at shoulder height for reasons we could only guess. The light was thin and patchy, filtering down through arrow-slit windows at irregular intervals, each one offering a momentary glimpse of the outside world. A flash of gray sky, the jagged silhouette of the surrounding mountains, a hint of the valley far below where the river wound like a strip of dull silver. Our boots echoed hollowly, the sound bouncing back in strange rhythms that made it feel as though someone might be following us just out of sight. Higher up, the windows widened slightly, and through them we caught more of the valley, a patchwork of olive groves, clusters of stone houses clinging to the slopes, and the faint, curling smoke of fires far in the distance. There were moments when the war seemed to disappear from view entirely, replaced by the timeless landscape of rural Italy. But then the next window would open on the scarred earth of the battlefield, craters pocking the hillsides, the faint lines of trenches etched into the muddy ground. The staircase narrowed again as we reached the final turn, and here the steps were littered with pigeon feathers and the brittle remains of nests tucked into the corners. The smell of the birds was sharp and slightly sweet, mingling with the cool draft that whispered down from above. When we finally stepped out into the tower chamber, the change in space was almost overwhelming. A round room with high, arched openings in every direction, each framing a different view of the world. Beyond, to the south, the road to Rome stretched in a pale ribbon toward the horizon, vanishing into a haze of hills. To the west, the mountains folded into one another like great sleeping animals, their peaks brushed with low, restless clouds. And to the east, the valley spread wide and green, dotted with fields and orchards that seemed impossibly calm under the winter light. But it was the view to the north that caught and held us there. The battlefield lay in full, unsoftened view, the scarred slopes leading up to the monastery, traced with the dark lines of German positions, the faint glint of wire, and here, and there the tiny, slow movements of men, too distant to identify. The wind was sharper up here, threading through the open arches and pulling at our jackets, carrying with it the mingled sense of smoke, damp earth, and something faintly floral drifting up from the lower slopes. On the floor in one corner lay a brass spyglass, its leather grip cracked, but when we raised it to the eye, the lenses still focused. Through it, the details of the battlefield sharpened, the curve of a gun barrel peeking from behind sandbags, the narrow track of a mule trail zigzagging down a slope, the faint flutter of a torn flag caught on barbed wire. In another corner, carved into the stone wall, was a list of names and dates, some from decades earlier, others as recent as the last few months, each one a trace of someone who had stood in this very spot and looked out over this same view. We stood there for a long time, letting the wind and the vastness of the scene work their way into us, until a voice crackled over the radio with new orders. We were to make our way down and prepare for movement toward the western cloisters, where a section of the monastery had collapsed in such a way that it might offer a sheltered approach to the enemy's outer positions. As we began the descent, the tower's spiral staircase seemed narrower, the steps steeper, and the light from the windows dimmer, as if the tower had already begun to close itself back around the view it had given us. By the time our boots touched the ground floor again, the scent of pigeons had faded, replaced by the familiar smell of dust and cold stone. Ahead lay the western cloisters, and with them a path that would take us closer to the front than we had been since we first set foot on Monte Cassino. And in the next part, I'll take you into that ruin where the walls themselves seem to remember every sound made within them. The western cloisters revealed themselves first as a low archway half buried under a heap of rubble, the stonework fractured but still clinging to its shape like a skeleton, stubbornly holding together after a fall. Squeezing through meant ducking low, the rough edges of shattered masonry brushing our shoulders, and emerging into a space that must once have been bright and airy, but now lay under a ceiling of fractured beams and sagging tiles. The cloisters. Open arcade faced what would have been the inner garden, though most of the arches were blocked by fallen stone, and the garden itself was a churned expanse of mud, brick dust, and shards of marble paving. Here and there, a few stubborn plants still clung to life patches of moss in the shaded corners. A lone vine curling up a broken column. A handful of weeds sprouting between the stones as if no amount of shelling could quite erase the impulse of things to grow. The air was thick with the mingled sense of damp stone, mildew, and the faint iron tang that seemed to hang in the air wherever fighting had passed recently. Our boots crunched on a carpet of debris-splintered wood, shards of roof tile, fragments of carved stone whose details had been erased by centuries of footsteps before being smashed by weeks of bombardment. Along one wall, the remnants of a fresco still clung stubbornly to the plaster, a scene of figures walking in procession, their outlines blurred, their faces all but gone, the colors faded into ghostly hints of ochre and blue. In the corner nearest the entrance, we found an overturned bench half buried in dust, beside which lay a scattering of small metal discs buttons, perhaps from a uniform long since rotted away. A shaft of sunlight angled down through a gap in the roof, illuminating the dust in golden motes and catching on the jagged edge of a marble basin that once might have held water for washing hands before prayer. The acoustics here were odd. Every sound seemed to linger just a fraction longer than it should, the echo of our movements folding back on itself until it was hard to tell whether the noise was ours or someone else's. The cloister's inner walkway curved in a broken horseshoe, each side leading to different doorways. One door stood ajar, its lower half splintered, and behind it we found a narrow passage lined with alcoves that once might have held statues. Most were empty, but in one, sheltered from direct light, a single stone figure remained, a monk, bent over a book, the folds of his robe finely carved, though his head had been sheared away by a blast. At his feet lay the broken head itself, the features still visible serene, eyes half-lidded as though reading something only he could see. We moved on, stepping over beams charred black at their ends, following the curve of the cloister toward the far wing. Here the destruction was worse. One entire section of wall had collapsed outward, creating a jagged gap that framed a view of the slopes beyond, where the German positions were hidden in the folds of the hillside. Through that gap came a faint, constant wind carrying the scent of pine and the far-off murmur of movement we couldn't quite place. It was near this opening that we found another of those strange little anomalies the mountain seemed to hold, a section of floor untouched amid the ruin, its tiles forming a perfect geometric pattern of interlocking stars and crosses, the glaze still gleaming faintly under the dust. One man crouched to touch it and muttered that it felt warmer than the rest of the stone, though perhaps it was only the sun falling just so through the gap. Beyond the cloister, through another door warped by moisture, lay a hall partially buried. In debris, but with just enough space to move through in single file. Here, the ceiling sagged dangerously, the plaster hanging in great pale sheets that stirred faintly as we passed, as though breathing. We emerged into a smaller courtyard where the walls bore the marks of recent fire-black soot fanning up from windows, the stone itself cracked by heat. In the center of the courtyard stood a well, its winch still intact, a rope dangling into darkness. A helmet, dented and missing its liner, hung from the rope's hook as if someone had left it there as a kind of signal. The water below caught the light in small glimmers, and the sound of our footsteps echoed faintly from its depths. There was something about this place, the cloisters, the courtyard, the well that felt like layers of time pressing together. Centuries of prayer, weeks of fighting, all held in the same breath. We lingered there longer than we meant to, and it was only when a voice on the radio crackled with a terse update that we were reminded to move on. Ahead lay the approach to the collapsed west wall, a path that would bring us dangerously close to enemy lines, but might also reveal one of the monastery's oldest and most hidden features. In the next part, I'll take you through that gap where the stones themselves seemed to guard what lay beyond. The collapsed west wall loomed ahead. Like the remains of some great beast, its jagged stones piled outward in a frozen wave, each block wedged at improbable angles as though caught mid-tumble. To pass through it meant picking our way carefully across uneven footing, the soles of our boots finding precarious purchase on edges dusted with fine gravel that slid treacherously under even the smallest shift of weight. The air here was different, sharper, cleaner, moving freely through the breach, carrying with it a mingled sense of pine from the lower slopes and the faint, acrid undertone of spent gunpowder drifting up from somewhere beyond sight. Through the gap, we could see the hills rolling away in folds of muted green and brown, their surfaces scarred in places where bombardment had stripped the earth bare, revealing pale undersoil like bones exposed by erosion. As we stepped into the open, the wind touched our faces with a cool, almost startling clarity, and for a moment it felt like the monastery had exhaled, letting us out into the wider mountain world. The ground beyond sloped unevenly, a mix of stone outcrops and patches of wiry grass that clung stubbornly to whatever cracks it could find. The first few meters were exposed, and we moved quickly, aware that the enemy positions were somewhere ahead in those folds of hillside, their lines hidden, but their presence almost palpable in the way the air seemed to watch us. Then, as if the mountain understood the need for discretion, the terrain dipped into a shallow depression where the walls of stone rose on either side, creating a natural corridor. Here the wind hushed, replaced by a deeper quiet, the kind that makes every small sound, the scuff of a boot, the jingle of a canteen, feel amplified. Along the walls of this corridor, we noticed something unexpected: carved markings, faint and weathered, running in irregular lines. Some were simple crosses, others were more intricate geometric patterns, looping knots, and once the rough outline of what might have been a fish. Whether these were the work of the monks, earlier builders, or someone far older, we couldn't say, but their presence lent the passage a feeling of being observed by generations past. Midway through, we found a small stone niche set low into the wall, inside which sat a clay jar with a narrow neck, its surface glazed in a soft green that caught the dim light. Lifting it revealed it to be heavier than expected, and when one of the men tilted it, something inside shifted with a dull, compact sound, too dense for liquid, too uniform for rubble. We had no time to investigate further. The jar was left where it sat, its mystery intact for now. The corridor narrowed before opening abruptly into a space that took us all by surprise. A small plateau, ringed by stone on three sides, where the remains of a structure stood just a single wall, and the foundation stones of what must once have been a small building, perhaps even predating the monastery above. The lone wall bore a window-like opening, perfectly squared, framing a view of the valley that seemed almost deliberately chosen to inspire contemplation. The ground here was strewn with fragments of terracotta roof tiles, some still showing, traces of the reddish glaze that must once have made them gleam in the sun. In the corner of the plateau, sheltered from the wind, a small patch of wild thyme grew, releasing its scent when brushed by our boots, a sudden burst of freshness that contrasted with the dry stone all around. We paused here longer than was sensible, each man taking in the view in silence, until the crackle of the radio reminded us that this was still contested ground. The path forward dipped again, winding along the base of a crumbling retaining wall whose stones were laced with roots from the vegetation above. At one point, we had to step carefully over a section where the wall had bulged outward, the stones held together only by the stubborn interweaving of those roots. Beyond this point, the terrain shifted once more, the rock giving way to a packed, earthen slope that bore the faint impressions of old footpaths, some overgrown, others still sharply defined, as though last used only days before. The slope led toward a shadowed opening between two outcrops, a narrow cleft that seemed to vanish into the mountain itself. It was here, at this threshold, that the air grew noticeably cooler and the light dimmed, and we realized that we might be about to step into something that had not seen daylight in centuries. In the next part, I'll take you through that cleft and into what lay hidden behind it, a place where the mountain kept its oldest secrets. The shadowed cleft drew us in like a breath being pulled through the mountain's teeth, the air immediately cooler and close, carrying the damp, mineral smell of rock that hasn't seen sun in a very long time. Our shoulders brushed the stone on either side, gritty and cold, and the light from behind us thinned to a pale ribbon that laid itself across the floor and stopped after a few paces as if politely refusing to intrude. We moved by touch and small, light-shielded flash beams cupped in palms finding. The first few yards scattered with what felt like the remains of a wall that had once sealed this gap. Squared stones, a hinge plate still clinging to mortar like a barnacle, a fragment of iron strap curved like a rib. The ceiling arched low then rose, and the passage widened into a pocket of space just large enough for 4 men to stand shoulder to shoulder. On the right-hand wall, shallow carvings emerged from the dark as we played the light across them. A simple cross flanked by 2 letters, a chi and a rho scratched with a knife tip. Below them, older marks, geometric knots, and a crude fish half lost in the mineral bloom that glazed the rock like frost. Somewhere ahead, water was ticking, measured, and patient, as if the mountain kept time with a single drop. We pressed on, boots whispering over packed earth, until the floor dipped and turned and gave us another small chamber where the ceiling dropped so low we had to stoop. Here the air smelled faintly of old smoke, not battle smoke, but the gentler, fatty scent of burned oil, and we found the reason in a scatter of terracotta lamp fragments, their lips blackened and their bellies still silty with ancient ash. A few sleeping bats hung above us like commas in a sentence the mountain had decided to pause. One shifted, resettled, and stilled. Every sound we made felt padded, as if wrapped in cloth, and yet every distant rumble from outside found its way. In artillery as a deep, slow pulse, the mountain passing the news along its bones. The path kinked again and opened into a longer gallery with a shallow channel cut along one side, water sliding through it as clear as glass, only a finger's width deep but insistent, the sort of monk's solution that outlives its makers. Once or twice the channel disappeared under stone and reappeared beyond, and where it rose near the surface little films of lime had formed like paper-thin leaves. Here we found a surprise that felt almost like a joke shared across centuries. A shard of glazed tile with a saffron-colored border, too bright for this dark, caught upright in a crack as if someone had pressed it there and never came back for it. We moved quietly. The closeness of the place seemed to ask for it, and let the beams graze the walls, picking out details the way you'd read with your fingertips. A niche worn smooth by hands. A peg bored into stone. Long rotted wood leaving. Only a ghost circle. A tangle of rootlets pushing through a fissure like hair through a seam. I became aware of my own small human noises, the thawing creak of my knees, the cloth rasp of my sleeve, the soft jingle of a single dog tag against my chest, and behind that the familiar chorus of a squad moving carefully. Someone's careful. Breathing, someone else's low hiss as a boot found a sharp edge, a short whispered curse that made two men smile in the dark. Gentle humor lives even here. When my pack scraped a protruding stone and sang a loud metallic note, the man behind me leaned in and muttered, "Tell it C to B flat, or the mountain's going to file a complaint." And just like that, the cold in my spine loosened a fraction. The gallery ended at a short flight of 5 steps cut straight into the rock, their centers worn like thumbprints. At the top stood a small landing, and beyond it, a door. It wasn't the grand iron-bound storybook kind, just planks laid vertically. With a crossbar of oak and 2 straps of iron, their rivets bright where a hand had recently rubbed the rust away, perhaps out of habit. Along the right-hand jamb, someone had carved a shallow groove, no wider than a fingernail, running at a slight angle toward the keyhole, which itself was narrow and old-fashioned, the sort you see in museums or in the stubborn doors of farmhouses. We gathered there and listened. Above us, faintly, a mule bell chimed twice and stopped. Nearer, the water kept its slow count, and in the stone itself, we could feel the far-off thud of the big guns as gentle shivers under our palms. The threshold smelled of beeswax and old linen, and there was a drift of dust across the sill with a curious scar drawn through it, as if a door had opened inward recently and brushed it into a crescent. On the lintel, almost invisible, someone had sketched a little line and dot diagram in charcoal 5 dots in a row, a line under the last 2, the kind of notation that means everything to the person who made it and nothing to anyone else. We checked the hinge pins, found them greased, not recently but not ages ago either, and I felt the first small prick of that now familiar Monte Cassino feeling, the sense of walking into a place where old lives and new dangers overlap so closely. You can't tell which breath you're hearing. No one said the word trap, but the thought moved among us anyway, light as a moth, and we made our peace with it, as soldiers always do, with a shrug for the unknown and a quiet agreement to move slowly and keep our wits open. Then the man next to me tapped my sleeve and pointed at the keyhole, at the long, shallow groove running into it, and then at my pocket. I'd forgotten the iron key until I felt its weight against my ribs again, colder now from the cave air. In the torchlight, its shaft showed that same faint groove we'd noticed when we found it under the water in the basin upstairs, like a worn vein in stone. The match between groove and groove wasn't perfect. You never expect storybook fits in real life, but it was close enough to make the air change, the way it does when weather's about to turn. We tested the door gently. It resisted honest, the way old doors do, not with malice, but with memory. Behind us, somebody's stomach growled at the worst traumatic moment, and the man with the mountain's complaint whispered, "Even the saints." Kept kitchens, which helped. We set a guard back along the gallery to listen for anything coming after. Another man watched the channel of water, as if it might decide to change its mind and flood, and I eased the keys bit toward the hole. There are moments when the world makes you small in the right way, so that every detail matters at human size. The cold of the iron under your thumb, the smell of damp cloth inside your sleeve, the stale ghost of coffee in your teeth, a microscrape. Of the key's shoulder against old brass. The iron slid, caught, slid again, and found its seat with a feel that traveled up the bone of my hand, then turned with a resistance that felt less like mechanics and more like somebody's hesitation. Remembered by wood. A soft click answered from inside, not the loud, theatrical thunk of films, but something closer to a sigh. We waited, ears straining. Nothing moved but the dust motes in our own light. I lifted the latch and eased the door inward. A breath of a breath. Warmer air touched our faces, threaded with the faintest hints of rosemary and paper, and a smell I didn't recognize at first, because you don't expect it underground. Bread. Not fresh, not like the kettle room below, but the dry, comforting ghost of it, like a cupboard that's held loaves for years. The light within was not torchlight. It was the thin blue of day sneaking through some concealed slit, enough to make shapes inside the room, but not enough to reveal them cleanly. A table, low and narrow. A row of shelves pinched into the wall, a ladder laid flat. And closer than any of that, a small, square box set on a stool with a wire leading up into the stone, the wire wrapped in cloth. My first thought was radio, and immediately my chest tightened in the old, practical way. If there was a radio hidden in a cave below a besieged monastery, somebody was brave or desperate, or both. We withdrew a fraction, the way you lean back from a doorbell you've just pressed at midnight, and let the silence test itself on us. No voice whispered, no boot scraped. The water kept counting. We slid inside by inches, beams down, fingers. Gentle, and saw what made the rosemary scent. Bunches of it hung to dry from a cord along the lintel, fragile needles ticking softly as the air stirred. Under them, on the shelves, were notebooks bound in twine and rolled maps in oilskin covers. And on the table, a small handbell like the one we'd found earlier on the underground bench, except this one had a crack up its side that ran like a thin smile. The box on the stool wasn't a transmitter after all. Not exactly. It was a home-built battery. 2 plates drowned in electrolyte inside a glass jar padded with rags. Wires climbing into a niche where a little set of headphones lay coiled like a sleeping animal. Someone had been listening, even if they hadn't been speaking. On the table lay a page in pencil, written in a hand that tried to be neat and failed under hurry. A column of dates and times, a few place names we knew from the valley, and next to several of them, a tiny 5-dot mark, the same as the charcoal note on the lintel underlined twice. It was the kind of thing you look at and feel your world tilt a degree, not with danger exactly, but with implication. We stood inside that room that shouldn't have existed where it did, in a monastery that was supposed to be only ruin and resistance, and felt the presence of people we hadn't met yet pressing against us with their intentions. Back toward the door, a cupboard stood with its latch caught under a wedge. From within came a dry, papery sound when we brushed it, and a smell of linen and candle smoke. We hadn't opened it yet. We hadn't traced the wire to see where it vanished into the stone. We hadn't rung the cracked bell to hear what note the mountain would give back. We hadn't even finished reading the page on the table, but a shadow moved across the slim seam of daylight in the far wall, and every head turned the same way at the same time, each of us thinking the same simple thought in the same quiet voice. Someone knows this place too. What we did when that shadow paused, and what stepped into view a heartbeat later, is the moment I'll take you into next. A shadow hesitated at that narrow seam of light, as if whoever cast it was deciding whether to stay outside or step into our thin slice of hidden air. And in that pause, even the water in the channel beyond seemed to hold its breath. Then the shape shifted and resolved into the outline of a head and shoulders, the light catching on the edge of a cap brim, the angle of a cheekbone, before the rest of the figure eased into view a man, thin and stooped from either age or long. Weeks underground, his uniform a faded patchwork thing that looked more like a monk's habit, sewn from military scraps than anything issued from a quartermaster. His boots were mismatched, one hobnailed, one smooth-soled, and he carried nothing in his hands except a small cloth bundle tied with twine. For a moment he didn't seem surprised to see us, as though the sight of armed strangers in this hidden chamber was simply one more fact to add to a long list of improbable facts the war had handed him. His eyes flicked over each of us, not nervously, but with the deliberate assessment of someone used to deciding quickly who might be a threat. And then, almost like a sigh, he set the bundle down on the table beside the cracked handbell. The rosemary above us trembled slightly as the air shifted with his movement, releasing a fresh burst of scent. And in that moment he seemed less like a soldier or a monk, and more like a caretaker stepping back into his workshop. No one spoke. First, the only sounds were the soft scrape of his boot against the flagstone, and the distant, filtered thud of artillery far above. Then, in accented but careful English, he said, "This is not your place." His tone neither hostile nor welcoming, more like someone stating the weather. One of our men, the one who had been a teacher before the war, answered in a calm voice, explaining we were clearing the monastery, that we had found the key, that we didn't mean to take anything. The man nodded slowly, as if all of this was unsurprising, then gestured toward the cupboard in the corner with a kind of weary invitation. When we unlatched it, the papery sound we'd heard earlier made sense. Inside were folded sheets of parchment and paper stacked in careful bundles, some so old the edges had curled and yellowed, others newer, the ink still dark and sharp. The top bundle held maps, some of the monastery as it stood before the bombardment, others of the surrounding valleys with faint pencil notes marking trails, water sources, and symbols we didn't recognize. Beneath those were pages of what looked like coded messages, the 5-dot symbol appearing again and again in the margins. The man didn't stop us from looking, but he didn't explain either. Instead, he moved to the shelves, took down one of the oilskin-covered maps, and rolled it open on the table, pointing to a spot well beyond the monastery's current front lines. "If you go here," he said quietly, "you can see them before they see you." Whether them meant the Germans or something else entirely, none of us asked just then. His presence had the same effect as the room itself, calming, but with a current of tension running underneath, the sense that we were skimming the surface of something deeper. On the stool by the table, the battery still hummed faintly, and the wire in the wall seemed almost to lean toward the man, as if waiting for him to put the headphones on again. But instead, he reached into his bundle and pulled out two things: a small loaf of dark bread, still warm, and a tin of something that smelled faintly of sweet wine and herbs. Without a word, he set them down and stepped back, as if to say, "This is all the explanation you'll get for now." We didn't eat immediately. War makes you cautious even with kindness, but the smell of the bread braided itself into the rosemary and paper until the room felt almost safe. Almost. From somewhere above, a vibration passed through the stone. Not the sharp jolt of an explosion, but the long, low shiver of something massive moving, perhaps, part of the monastery giving way, perhaps the earth itself shifting under bombardment. Dust sifted from the ceiling, and the man's gaze flicked upward, his mouth tightening for the first time. "You shouldn't stay?" he said simply, and for the first time there was urgency in his voice. He lifted the cracked bell and set it in my hand as if passing on a burden. "If you hear this sound," he added, "follow it." Then, before we could ask anything more, he slipped back toward that narrow seam of daylight and was gone, leaving only the faint ripple of air. In his wake, we stood there for a moment, caught between the pull to follow and the need to know more about this place, until a new sound, distant, rhythmic, and growing louder, began threading its way down the stone passages toward us. In the next part, I'll take you to what was waiting at the other end of that sound, and why it made every man in the room forget for a moment, which side of the mountain he was on. We left the hidden room as the sound drew nearer, boots moving in rhythm without needing orders. The cracked bell in my pocket, a strange new weight against my thigh. Its curve warmed slightly from my hand. The air in the gallery was cooler now, carrying a sharper edge, as if the mountain itself was bracing for something. And each step seemed to echo farther than it should, the reverberations folding into the steady pulse of that unseen approach. When we emerged into the cleft, the light outside had shifted grayer, heavier, the kind of sky that flattens the landscape and makes every shadow feel deliberate, and from somewhere across the slope came that same measured rhythm, clearer. Now, not boots but hooves, the faint jingle of tack accompanying them. For a heartbeat, I thought of mules bringing supplies, the ordinary business of war, but as the figures came into view through the drifting mist, they were neither burdened animals nor enemy patrols. They were monks, actual monks in dark robes, their hoods up, each leading a mule laden not with ammunition, but with bundles wrapped in cloth and wicker baskets whose lids were tied with rope. They moved in complete silence save for the sound of the animals, and when they reached the gap in the wall, they did not startle at the sight of us. One, his face lined and eyes bright under the shadow of his hood, gave a brief nod, the kind you might give a neighbor at the market, then gestured for us to step aside. They passed single file into the cloisters, vanishing behind the archway, the scent of pine and hay, and something faintly sweet perhaps, bread trailing after them. For a long moment none of us spoke. It felt as though we had been allowed to glimpse a layer of the mountain's life that existed entirely apart from the siege, a rhythm older and steadier than the guns. When we finally turned to make our way back toward the monastery's inhabited sections, the cracked bell shifted in my pocket and gave a faint chime, a soft, imperfect note that nonetheless carried cleanly into the cool air. I glanced once over, my shoulder at the path the monks had taken, now empty, and felt the peculiar certainty that somewhere inside these walls, hidden behind layers of stone and silence, their work would continue long after we were gone. The war would grind on for days, weeks, perhaps months, but Monte Cassino seemed to hold in its heart a pulse that no bombardment could erase, a reminder that even in a place scoured by history's hardest hands, there were still corridors where the air smelled of rosemary and bread, and where a bell, cracked but unbroken, could still be rung.